I charge thee, therefore, before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick and the dead at his appearing and his kingdom. Preach the word. Be instant in season, out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and doctrine. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. But watch thou in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, make full proof of thy ministry. For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day. And not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. Do thy diligence to come shortly unto me. As you were. Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb. And like the Aretha Franklin song in Pulp Fiction, I am the son of a preacher man. And every September, around Labor Day, as many return from summer vacations to various locations, and while some were preparing to return back to school, my father would preach probably his most remembered sermon from this text in 2 Timothy on our annual Homecoming Sunday. After a parade through the neighborhood surrounding our church, my father's unique mission country, in a neighborhood section that today finds a park with his name bordering a school that also bears his name during our Homecoming Sunday service at the end of each summer. The topic of that sermon was a popular title for many preachers, Come Before Winter. The letters of the former persecutor of Christians from Tarsus, who had redirected his energies to prolific letters to the churches, not often flattering, and Daddy would often use his own military experience in the National Guard, serving as the state chaplain, traveling up to Fort Drum in upstate New York to describe the St. Lawrence River, named for that saint who was the martyr, and the treacherous ice that would impede navigation, as he attempted to describe the task for which he had summoned his most faithful disciple Timothy, as he urged him to do his diligence to assist him in the last days of a flight in which he had fought a good fight and had kept the faith, and implored his friend, therefore, to come before winter, when navigation would be impossible. And so for the next few minutes, and in this video series, having myself had the opportunity to engage in a once-in-a-lifetime chance to take battle in both state and federal courts, bringing the first and longest surviving challenges against the lockdowns as well as the facial coverings mandates, and preparing to qualify for the ballot as the only candidate for the Arlington Public School Board who has actually presented proposals to address a century-and-a-half-old achievement gap in public schools, as well as the only candidate who have ever brought not just one but two cases in court against the school board that had, before court-ordered desegregation, failed to construct an adequate number of segregated schools for children of color, and had compelled those displaced to seek a public education across the Potomac River without even making provisions for payment for that education. And that had taken 5 years. 5 years after the landmark Brown decision to proceed with all deliberate speed to provide an equal education for all, only after a move to replace the entire public school board in resistance, and only after an additional mandate by the federal courts for them to comply with the orders of the highest court in the land. I shall begin by using a story from recent African American history that had occurred during my own lifetime with a man I actually met and involving an athlete legend with whom most are familiar, if only from movies like the one starring Will Smith that recorded the famous Rumble in the Jungle, where he had reclaimed his crown from George Foreman in the African nation of Uganda, then ruled by the despotic potentate Idi Amin, but who also had a case alleging a faith that we had not kept that reached the nation's highest court, and which even became the topic of an HBO movie regarding his decision not to join the army, like the rock and roll legend King Elvis Presley, but rather to resist, upon, among others, his claim that jihad notwithstanding, the religion of a professional boxer yet forbade him from service in the military service of this nation. In preface, it is appropriate to state that not only as a veteran with 2 decades of military service, but also as a retired field grade Army officer, in accordance with Article 4 of the Armed Forces Code of Conduct, I will never forget that I am an American fighting man, responsible for my actions and dedicated to principles which made my country free. Moral rival trust in my God and in the United States of America. But regrettably, less than 25% of age-eligible Americans are even qualified to take that oath of service that I did after tanks from Iraq rolled into the sovereign nation of Kuwait, and that find less than 1% of those who are eligible to do so, most of whom have family members, just as I did, as a third-generation military officer, who have served this nation in uniform and under solemn oath before them, and most of them, believe it or not, with ancestors who fought on the wrong side of a civil war. On July 25th, 1955, Secretary of Defense Charles E. Wilson prepared a letter to the drafting committee for that code of conduct after their serious deliberations that took place over the course of 2 months, and stated that the code of conduct we recommend sets a high standard and a reasonable course for members of the armed forces of the future. The conscience and heart of all Americans are needed in the support of this code, and the best of training can be provided in our homes, by our schools and churches, and by the armed forces will be required for all who undertake to live by this code. Further, Secretary of Defense Wilson emphasized with words so appropriate for present times that America can no longer afford to think in terms of a limited number of fighting men becoming prisoners of war in the hands of an enemy in some distant land. Modern warfare has brought the challenge to the doorstep of every citizen, and so the code we propose may well be a code for all Americans if the problem of survival should ever come to our main streets. And now we are all engaged in a great unconventional war against an invisible enemy, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. So welcome to the Army Soldier. From 1968 to 1971, while a conflict raged in Southeast Asia, an African-American man from Louisville, Kentucky brought several cases before the federal judiciary to challenge not just allegedly unlawful government surveillance, but also a total of 7 determinations that he had been eligible for the draft into the military during the Vietnam War. And he raised several objections, including conscientious objector status, as well as a claim that he was, in fact, a minister, raising some questions as to whether he held a sincerely held faith belief, or was simply attempting to dodge the draft like many did during what has often been referred to as a police action, and certainly an undeclared war against the communist regime in Saigon. And it is intriguing that although this world heavyweight champion was by then known to the world as the Gradest or Muhammad Ali, the court caption for this line of cases in history state boldly only Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., the United States of America. In one such case heard by the Fifth Circuit during the turbulent year of 1968 that found not only the black fist being raised by athletes attending the Olympics, but also the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and the ensuing riots that ravaged cities across the nation that summer that called my father into service in riots during North. after the murder of his friend. The presiding jurist stated unwaveringly, "It is undeniable, as appellant contends, that conscription deprives an individual of his liberty and may even take his life. But we cannot properly compare the military draft to a criminal prosecution. There is no stigma attached to wearing the military uniform of the United States. To the contrary, it is a badge of highest honor. Service under the flag of our country cannot properly be likened to imprisonment in a penitentiary. A proud nation with a long tradition of valor and bravery on the battlefield, with vivid memories in modern times of distant places, some with unusual names such as Chateau Thierry, Normandy, Iwo Jima, and Khe Sanh, where Americans have fought and died to preserve freedom, would never permit a comparison so odious. It is the same willingness of Americans to sacrifice their lives in the military service of the country which has made it possible to establish the United States as a free nation, and which has successfully warded off the encroachments of its enemies. The knowledge that military service must sometimes be borne by and imposed on free men, so their freedom may be preserved, is woven deeply into the fabric of the American experience." That court said, quoting President Lyndon Baines Johnson from his message on selective service to the Congress on March 6, 1967. And that judicial tribunal continued stating, "The war powers of Congress to raise and support armies are constitutionally authorized and are of paramount public importance because they directly involve the protection and preservation of the nation itself. In this vital and sensitive area, it behooves the judiciary to recognize the imperative necessity for the maintenance of the national integrity as upheld by the military forces of the United States. The Universal Military Training and Service Act provides that every male citizen of the United States between certain ages shall register and be subject to induction in the armed forces of the United States. Exemptions from service, such as for conscientious objectors or ministers of religion, are matters of legislative grace. It has been long established that there is no constitutional right to exemption from military service by virtue of conscientious objection or religious calling. These exemptions do not spring from the Constitution, but from the Congress. The Supreme Court said in Jacobson v. Commonwealth of Massachusetts, 1905, that the liberty secured by the 14th Amendment, a person may be compelled by force if need be, against his will and without regard to his personal wishes or his pecuniary interests or even his religious or political convictions, to take his place in the ranks of the army of his country and risk the chance of being shot in its defense. And with over half of Americans today having volunteered for vaccination shots, described by the President Joe Biden as our best defense against what has often been described as an invisible enemy, and what the nation's only physician serving as a state governor out north, a former Army surgeon, as fighting a biological war, it is of note that that case involving the fighter Cassius Clay, most popularly known as the greatest Muhammad Ali, had referred to Jacobson v. Massachusetts, a case often recited during the current public health crisis, and a case that had challenged not the draft or military service, but rather it was a case involving one who might be described today as an anti-vaxxer, perhaps even a conspiracy theorist, aspersions against character but not addressing the true arguments on the merits, and with regard to vaccinations against smallpox in the case of Jacobson v. Massachusetts, a highly contagious disease, validated by empirical measure as a highly contagious disease with a 60% attack rate among close tracer contacts, which scientists since the 1980s have noticed as the threshold in infection for a capability to set off a super spreader event, but as high as 12 times the secondary attack rate that has been consistently found for the current pandemic pathogen in large sample size trace contact studies, examining as few as almost 56,000 laboratory confirmed cases in China to over 3 million laboratory confirmed cases in India, the largest sample size tracer contact study to date. But also the pathogen for which over 50% of adult Americans, over 54% of adults in Virginia have yet volunteered without a mandate to be administered a vaccine developed under the Emergency Use Authorization at the FDA and delivered through the Defense Production Act with a priority upon arrival and delivery in mid-December in Virginia of Moderna and Pfizer vaccines for placement into vials first for prioritized distribution thereafter to healthcare workers on the front lines in providing care to Virginia's civilian population, not necessarily in any connection to the military, and to people in long-term care facilities, who account for over half of the fatalities. And today, the University of Virginia, as well as other educational institutions, have begun to make decisions to vaccinate students and children under the age of 18, well outside the parameters of what is described as the domestic industrial base under the Defense Production Act, primarily focused towards national security and the defense of this nation. In the next video, we shall pick up on this topic regarding the Jacobson v. Massachusetts decision and its place in the Cassius Clay litigation, specifically with regard to the decision of the current President Joe Biden and Virginia Governor Ralph Northam, a graduate of Virginia Military Institute and former Army surgeon, to utilize the Defense Production Act in the Great American Rescue Plan to reopen the nation before Independence Day, announcing the lifting of restrictions on Memorial Day, and particularly the use of this measure to achieve an unknown to science 80% herd immunity, with a provision that is restricted for use to address a communicable disease. It cannot address a communicable disease, and which might only be utilized in the current public health crisis to address a biological agent that had been deployed against targets of national security interest, none of which those populations of elderly in nursing homes nor children going to school describes, and to protect the domestic industrial base, or our means of waging war, but that has prioritized the distribution of the fruits of that effort for persons over the age to render military service residing in nursing homes, and now is poised to be used to deliver vaccines to children too young to enlist or be drafted into military service. Or are you soldiers in the Army now? This briefing was unclassified. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. Carry on. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb. I bet you.
Can I be excused?